everyone turn to Job chapter 15. So it's been a little while since I've had the opportunity to teach. Something's been keeping me occupied. And so I'll give a rather lengthy review, at least, of what has happened up to this point. So in the book of Job, we saw at the very start that Job was the wealthiest and most powerful man, at least of the East, possibly the whole world, of his time. And he was the most righteous man on earth, by God's own words. He was the one who put forth the most effort to try and be godly, tried harder than anyone else to follow God's commands, rose up daily and sacrificed for his sins and the sins of his children. And we learned later that was specifically because he was afraid of losing the many things God had given him, as he had an extensive family, a high position, and pretty much everything that someone could want. He, of course, lost all of this wealth, his status, his family. His wife left him, all of his children died, and then he was exiled from the city of Uz by the people who lived there. And it seems pretty clear that he was then pretty much relegated to living amongst the dump that was outside the city where all the garbage and the vermin lived. His three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, came from distant, probably Arab cities, what we would call Arab cities at least, to come and comfort him. Or at least that was the pretense they came under, and they probably meant it to an extent. They remained silent for 7 days upon arriving, which seems, they were really there to try and help him, were very sad upon seeing him, and after those 7 days, Job broke the silence by bemoaning his loss, wishing that he was dead, and asking why this is happening to him. Eliphaz, which was pretty much the leader of these three friends, the one who kind of organized them all, he responded by accusing Job of committing open, notorious, and horrible sins that brought all this judgment upon him, essentially stating that the evidence for this was his own experiences, what he'd seen in the world, which contradict what everyone else has seen, and a spirit that he saw in a dream who told him that God did not trust his own angels, didn't trust men, everyone was terrible, and only the wicked somehow, though, suffer terrible loss while the righteous don't, and then exhorted him to repent of the sins that he hadn't committed, but that they assume he did, so that he could be restored to a higher status. Job, of course, countered this by vindicating himself, bemoaning his position more, and wishing he was dead again, which prompted emotional responses from the other friends, which Job responded to, and they went back and forth for a while, steadily growing more and more aggressive and emotional, until the last few chapters, last 3, I believe, in which Job had the longest speech so far. He had a very long tirade where he railed against them for coming against him under false pretenses, said you claimed you were here to comfort me, you acted this way, and then you immediately turned it around and tried to make me feel terrible about myself to make yourself feel better. You're like bandits waiting on the side of a road to ambush someone. He told them they didn't know what they were talking about. Every thought they've ever had, he had a long time ago because he's smarter than all of them put together. Job accused them of that, which they didn't like at all. He then proclaimed his innocence and said that he didn't deserve anything that was happening. God was treating him far too harshly, that he did not deserve it. And in that process, accused God of essentially, committed blasphemy by accusing God of going against his word and not honoring the bargain he made with mankind of covering their sin as long as they maintain their sacrifices. This, of course, is not true. Just because your sin is covered doesn't mean you don't suffer consequences for it. Adam was in heaven. As he knows, he talked about the righteousness of the men of the past, of the fathers, and yet Adam still died, which was a consequence of his sin. So he should have known better, but Job has made clear repeatedly throughout these chapters as well that he is speaking out of emotion. He was apparently conscious enough to know he was speaking out of emotion, but not to withhold his emotion from his words. So he said a lot of things in heated anger and said specifically that he will not hold himself back from any words because he doesn't care anymore and he'd rather just die. And so he continued to rail against his friends and blaspheme against God. He eventually stopped, probably assuming that was it, that his friends would be done talking now, which of course they were not. What we've seen from his friends so far is that they, while wise for men, pale in comparison to Job himself. They don't know nearly as much as him. They're not nearly as logical. Their arguments have many flaws, contradict themselves all the time. Some of the most notable ones being they claim only the wicked suffer, but then in this very same argument, the same chapter even, they will say that all men are wicked. And so they're basically contradicting their own arguments. It seems clear to me the spirit that spoke to Eliphaz was Satan, given authority to turn Job's friends against him, like he turned everything else against him. And Eliphaz believed that along with his friends because they did not want to face the reality that they could also lose everything like Job did at the drop of a hat, even if they did everything they were supposed to. They liked the comfort and safety of feeling like they're actually good and they deserve the things that they have, so God's not going to take them away, which means Job must be in the wrong. And because they've already come to that conclusion, no matter what he says, they will never change their minds. So in chapter 15, Eliphaz is now responding to Job's long speech. And he begins by addressing Job's accusations against him and his other friends. Then answered Eliphaz the Temanite and said, should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? Should he reason with unprofitable talk or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? Yea, thou castest off fear and restrainest prayer before God. For thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I. Yea, thine own lips testify against thee. Art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? What knowest thou that we know not? What understandest thou which is not in us? With us are both the gray-headed and very aged men, much elder than thy father. So he claims that Job's words mean as much as the wind. They're loud, they're distracting, but they hold no real meaning. This is very similar to several accusations that Job's friends have made against him in the past, essentially accusing him of being full of hot air or the east wind, where everything he says is pointless and he's just using words because he can. Says that all of his knowledge is empty, essentially saying you don't know what you're talking about, you're just proclaiming nonsense, and that the talk is unprofitable, so it doesn't do any good to anyone. These are not logical rebuttals to anything Job said. He's just sort of asserting you're wrong because you're wrong and trying to move on. These are common themes of Job's friends. They don't use logic at all in their arguments because they've committed themselves to something they should know isn't true. Once you do that, then you lose logical ground to stand on and can no longer use it effectively. It's likely that he's using a lot more emotion now because Job personally attacked him and his friends for the first time. Prior to this, Job would counter their arguments, proclaim his own innocence, and then be sad for a while. But in those last few chapters, for the first time, Job took personal shots at them and said that he was smarter than all of them and they didn't know what they were talking about. They probably took that very personally. Eliphaz comes at this a lot more aggressively than he has before, and it's important to note that he was the least aggressive and emotional of Job's friends before. Both Bildad and Zophar, who both have spoken up to this point, had much shorter arguments than Eliphaz, and they were far more aggressive, pointed, and angry than Eliphaz was. Meaning they probably took it very personally that Job was insinuating this could also happen to them. So Eliphaz claims that Job is contradicting himself by lying. He's saying, you say that you're doing right, and then you proclaim falsehoods. This is sort of a there's no win situation. It's like a witch hunt where they give a broom to a witch and put her up on a cliffside and say, if you're a witch, then you can fly back to safety, and if you're not, then you'll die a good Christian death. It's like that sort of thing. There's no win here at all. Either you confess and you die, or you're guilty, or you maintain your innocence if you are innocent, and everyone calls you a liar because they've already decided that you're wrong. Now, in reality, a lot of witch hunts actually were real, but the ones that people mostly look at are the kinds that I'm talking about, the ones that are designed to have no way out. Eliphaz and his friends have already decided what's true, or what they're going to assume is true, and anything that Job says against that, they're going to call a lie and use as evidence of why he deserves this. He claims that Job is using the tongue of the crafty. This is the sort of thing that fools say when you have logical rebuttals to their arguments. You see it from leftists in our day and age all the time. They'll say that you're using word traps and linguistic nonsense to try and get around the heart of their argument. But these are what arguments are made of. They're made of words. They're made of logic. And his friends are trying to argue with him logically. At least that's the platform they're standing on. And so this, again, is not a logical rebuttal, saying that you're being crafty in your speech. That's the whole point of an argument, is to be crafty in your speech. It's also to have actual solid ground to stand on, to have real facts and information, which Job has also used. But if you're not eloquent, then you're probably going to lose the argument anyway, because person's going to run in circles around you. Job is far better at this than they are, and so he is using the tongue of the crafty. The hypocrisy of this is Eliphaz and his friends have also tried to use the tongue of the crafty. They're just not very good at it, and so they're angry that Job is capable of doing it. He accuses Job of condemning himself in his words, which, in fairness, he has. Job has committed quite a bit of blasphemy so far by accusing God of doing things that God cannot and has not ever done. He's accused him of following on his heels like a hunter or a schoolmaster who gives him no leeway, that the moment he errs, God punishes him harshly for it. claims that God is holding the sins of his youth against him and the sins of his children against him, that he is not committed or that have already supposed to be covered. Essentially, what that tells us about Job's enlightenment about this whole situation is that he has not progressed any further than his friends. His friends assume this is because of Job's open and notorious sins. Job is assuming this is because of his private and repented of sins. Both of these conclusions are wrong. This is happening because God is sovereign. He can do with humanity whatever he wills, and that's exactly what he's done with Job. He doesn't need a reason, at least not one that he's going to give anyone, other than he is God and he will do what he pleases. So Job, though he knows that his friends are wrong, doesn't really have a better answer than them. He assumes this is about his own sin, and in assuming that, he believes that God has gone against his word and is mistreating him. That is blasphemy, that is a sin, and God does take it seriously. As we will see at the end of the book, God is not happy with those accusations. So Job has opened himself up to some rebuttals from Eliphaz, but Eliphaz doesn't really capitalize on those quite as much. Now, Eliphaz rhetorically asks Job if he knows that everything God knows. We see that in verse 7. Art thou the first man that was born, or wast thou made before the hills? Hast thou heard the secret of God, and dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? He's asking him, do you know everything God does? Were you there at the very start? You know everything even as much as Adam? Are you older than our hills? Because if you're not, then you can't know everything either, which Job has also asserted before, that he doesn't know everything. All that he's really said is they don't know everything, which they've also said. But they've done this repeatedly so far, taking what Job has said and just sort of saying it back at him and acting like that's also an argument. This is the same thing, almost word for word, that Job has said to them in a prior chapter. And so it is a fair question. Job has asserted things that he doesn't know, but not nearly as much as them. They're just trying to, or Eliphaz specifically, is trying to get around the fact that Job's information is more correct than his. It makes more sense. It's more in line with reality. And so he's going to just accuse him of not having any basis to stand on. This is what we call a plea to authority, and we'll see that in verse 10 as well. It says, with us are both the gray-headed and very aged men. An appeal to authority is a logical error in which you cannot articulate your own position. So you say, well, that guy said that I was right, so that means I'm right. This is a logical fallacy. If that's your argument, then your argument is wrong. Then you don't have an argument. It's as much a fallacy as a straw man, where you just assert you're right because something that has never happened has happened. Or begging the question, where for you to be right, you have to be right. We see that in evolution, where they claim the fossils are old because of the rocks we find them in. And when you ask them how old the rocks are, they say it's because of the fossils that we found in them. That's begging the question. In order for your argument to be correct, you have to already assume that it is correct. Essentially, it has to stand on itself. That's illogical. That's a fallacy. You can't make an argument that way. Similarly, if your argument relies on the authority of anyone other than the person who knows everything, which is God, which means if it relies on any man to stand, on any man's word, then your argument is flawed, and it will fall apart if anyone really looks at it too closely. Well, that's what Eliphaz has done from the start. Every argument that he has is predicated on his own eyes, which isn't always wrong, but is definitely an easy pitfall, and then on the words of a spirit, which they all know can lie, because they've all already shown in the past that they have acute knowledge of the sin of Adam, what happened in the Garden of Eden, and by extension, they know that the devil was involved in the fall of man, which means they know spirits can lie. And yet Eliphaz believed this one the moment that it spoke to him, and is now using it essentially as the authority, and then saying, well, men in the past believe what we did. Now, on top of this being a logical fallacy, the old men and the gray-headed are not on his side, at least not that we have any writings of. If you go into the past, what we see are Enoch and Abel. They were both prophets according to the Lord, which means they wouldn't have proclaimed this because we know it's wrong. So they're not standing on those. They could be standing on any old men. And as we know in reality, just because you're old doesn't mean you're right. You see that in our Congress, especially right now, but really just anywhere in the world. The only way that you're going to be right is if you're relying on the Bible. Sometimes you can get far just relying on evidence in the world, but your own eyes, your own ears, and your own mind can trick you. The Bible can't. And so the people who try to rely on anyone else's words or anyone else's agreements, whether they're human or spiritual, apart from God, have flawed arguments and should simply be disregarded. Well, that's how Eliphaz predicates his arguments. All of them are based on the word of this Spirit. Right from the start, that was what his assertions were about. And then just proclaiming falsehoods, like only the wicked perish and the righteous survive. They all know that that's false. That's been false since the dawn of time. the righteous, the first righteous man to die was Abel. He died before, near as we can tell at least, he didn't even have any children yet, which means he died pretty young. He was righteous, didn't deserve that, and he was cut down in his prime by a wicked man who went on to live a very long life, had many children, and then died of natural causes. So even from the start of human history, the wicked lived long, and the righteous died at the hands of the wicked. So Eliphaz's own arguments are mostly based on assertions that are clearly, provably false, and he just asserts that he has authority because other people have agreed with him, even though he also can't produce any evidence or examples of people that do, other than this one spirit that he saw in a dream one time that might have just been a dream also. So it's good to bear all this in mind, that as he's arguing these things, you'll see Job continue to get more and more aggressive as time goes on, and that's part of the reason why. These men were his friends for many years. They were wise men. They weren't as wise as him, but they were wise in their cities. There's a reason they're here. There's a reason they have the statuses that they do. It's because they are genuinely intelligent and wise for men. And they are falling into the most basic traps that they should all know better than, just to make themselves feel better. That would be enraging for anyone, especially someone in Job's position, who, as he stated before, he has not had any comfortable or good sleep. He can barely sleep at all. When he does, it's painful and short. He can't enjoy any food, so he barely eats, and it hurts when he does. He is covered head to toe in boils, and basically the sickness that he's got is a combination of every terrible sickness you can imagine, according to his own words. So he's in a very fragile state anyway. His emotions are ready to snap at a moment's notice. And these people coming here throwing illogical arguments at him just to make him feel worse so that they will feel better when they claim to be his friends makes him very angry, because they also have no ground to stand on. Now, Eliphaz, he states that he and his friends know everything Job does. This, of course, is incorrect. Job has said the same thing to them before. He said, I know more than all of you. Eliphaz is now saying, well, we know more than you. It's like a school children throwing insults at each other. It, of course, has no real meaning to it at all. And he continues, however, with a more intelligent reply. Over in verse 11, are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? Why doth thine heart carry thee away? And what do thy eyes wink at? That thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth. What is man, that he should be clean? And he which is born of a woman, that he should be righteous? Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints. Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water? So he directs this first at Job's despair, which has been a central theme of everything Job has said. I talk about his rebuttals to his friends, but those are, in all honesty, a very small portion of what he said. I'd say about probably 10% at most of what he said have been directed at his friends. Probably about 30% has been directed at God, asking why this is happening. And the rest has been, my life is terrible and I want to die. That has been a very central theme to his entire argument, has been how miserable his life is. And so that's what Eliphaz targets here. He says, are the consolations of God small with thee? Is there any secret thing with thee? So what he's asking is, why aren't you comforted in the knowledge of God? Job has already stated in his own arguments that he trusts God. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. He stated that he knows he'll rise at the latter end, that he knows he'll be resurrected, that he knows there's a heaven ahead of him, and none of these things comfort him at all. Now, Eliphaz is asking why. If you believe these things, then why aren't you comforted? You've comforted other people with these things. Eliphaz told Job that also in the past, talked about him comforting and helping other people who were struggling, counseling them, giving them wisdom. He used it in a way to say, you counseled them in this way, so you should do the same thing, meaning repent. Job probably saw a lot of very sinful people who were in struggling situations. They came to him for help, and he told them, well, it's happening because you're committing terrible sins. Stop doing that. That's the first step. So they were trying to say you should do that too. But it's clear from that context that Job had a history, a reputation of helping people, of giving his wisdom out to those around him. Part of that help would definitely be the consolation of the righteous, that you have a place in heaven, that you're going to be resurrected, that all of this pain and misery is temporary. So Eliphaz is asking, why isn't this comforting to you? It's a fair question, and it's one that Job really doesn't have an answer to, except I'm in pain right now. That's fair. None of us have ever been through anything that Job has been through. I mean, more than just the physical agony that he's in, which will quickly overwhelm. I mean, I know people talk about how terrible emotional pain is, and it is terrible. But physical agony is worse when it gets to a higher extent, at least in here. It wears on the mind a lot more. just as heavily as emotional, except you also can't do anything. So it makes you feel far more miserable. Job has talked about his days feeling shorter and shorter, like a weaver's shuttle that moves back and forth across a loom faster than the eye can blink. It feels like every single day is completely pointless. He gets nothing done. No one will even talk to him. He basically spends them struggling for food that is painful to eat so that he can barely sleep until the next sunrise, which he hopes never comes. So his life is miserable. He can't do anything, and he's in pain, and he has no one because his wife left him and his children are dead. So his misery is understandable. I'd be miserable too. But Eliphaz's question of why aren't you happy that there's something better at the end of this? Why don't you trust God? It's a fair response, and it predicates his next question. Why doth thine heart carry thee away, and what do thy eyes wink at, that thou turnest thy spirit against God, and lettest such words go out of thy mouth? He's essentially accusing Job of being a false believer. Saying, you don't really believe this then, because now you're blaspheming God and you're ignoring the comforts and consolations that he's given you. You know what's going to happen, or at least you should know if you really believe it. But it looks like you don't, because you're insulting God and you're completely denying all of the comforts that he gives you. Again, a very fair argument, one that Job left himself completely open to by blaspheming God in his past arguments. Now, Eliphaz's next claim is both true and false. He says in verse 14, what is man that he should be clean, and he which is born of a woman that he should be righteous? That's true. Men are not clean. We're not righteous. We're wicked from birth. Now, again, this is contradictory to his past statements where he claims that only the wicked suffer. Well, that's true. Only the wicked suffer. It's why every man suffers. That doesn't help us at all in this situation. Everyone already knows that, because what he really means is only the wicked that I consider wicked suffer. But if you haven't done sin that I consider is that bad, then you probably don't suffer. But also, all men are wicked. It's very contradictory. He's contradicting himself because this is an obvious self-evident fact that he can't deny. He can't deny that men are wicked by birth. All of us are. Everyone knows that. But to compare that to his other arguments would cause them all to implode. So he just sort of ignores the connection between the two and just states this separately from any other claim that only the wicked suffer. Now, his question, though, is a little interesting. It's not really prophetic, but the answer to what is man, he should be clean, and he which is born of woman, that he should be righteous, the answer is the Lord Jesus Christ, because he is both of these things, and he is clean and righteous. He's born of a woman, and he was righteous from birth. He's a man, and he is perfectly clean, because he was the only one who never sinned. So there is someone who can do this. Job has asked in the past, who can draw a clean thing out of an unclean? The answer to that, of course, is God. God is the only person who ever did that, and he did it specifically to save mankind. So it's sort of an interesting connection there that none of them seem to see yet. Now he says in verse 15, behold, he putteth no trust in his saints, yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. This is an abject lie. Now, we see back in chapter 4, verse 18. This was stated by Eliphaz in the past. Let's go take a look at it real quick. So in chapter 4, verse 18, Eliphaz states, behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, which are crushed before the moth? So there he's basically saying God doesn't trust his own angels. Why would he trust men? The angels are way better than us. And if so, obviously we're so terrible that God will just crush us down. This is a lie. He was stated this while talking about what the Spirit had said to him. If this was Satan, which I believe it was, Satan, we know, is very angry, still rebellious, that God cast him out of heaven. God did not charge his angels with folly. You can't find that anywhere in the Bible, and I don't see why he would if they're righteous and follow his commands. The only ones he would charge with folly are the rebels who turned against him and were cast out of heaven, because that's foolish to deny God's own power and rebel against him when he is God. You're a fool, especially if you're an angel. So those angels he charged with folly. He doesn't trust them with anything, but he trusts angels with many other things. He talks all the time about angels protecting the children of God. There were angels following Elisha when he was captured. That was a job that he gave them. He has told an angel to deliver the body of Moses elsewhere. Michael protected it from Satan. Michael himself escorted messengers to the prophet Daniel, who was spoken to by Gabriel. The messenger angel Gabriel delivered the most important message of all time to Mary. These are all very important jobs, which God gave exclusively to his angels. And you can look through the book of Revelation to see the many other times, many other examples of what's going to happen in the future, the angels that God is going to use to accomplish many different tasks. He does trust his angels, the holy ones. What he doesn't trust are Satan and his angels. Them he only gives jobs when he wants them to cause destruction and chaos. We see that in a few places where he talks about tempting spirits, sending them into the midst of certain people. Micaiah said that to Ahab and his prophets, his false prophets. They were prophesying lies. Micaiah said that he had seen heaven, where the Lord asked the sons of God, who can go and be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets? One of them said, I can. Well, God's angels wouldn't be a lying spirit. It's the demons who would be. So that's the one that he sent. So he trusts them to lie, to cheat and steal and cause destruction, but he trusts his own angels quite a lot. And he trusts us with very important tasks, such as, discipling the world and getting people saved, which is his entire purpose as far as humanity is concerned. He created all of time, all of space, this entire world and the entire human race for the sole purpose of saving humans, just for his own glory. But it's saving humans that it's all about, and that task he left to us. Well, that's quite a responsibility. That's a lot of trust that he put in his saints, which we are. So Eliphaz's claim that he puts no trust in his saints, that's a slander from Satan, where he claims that God put men and angels into the entire universe just to not trust them with anything, because that's how Satan looks at it, because he's a rebel. So Eliphaz is working on faulty information. This is a callback to something he said before that was incorrect. It says, how much more abominable and filthy is man which drinketh iniquity like water? Well, while it's true that men are far more wicked than the holy angels, we are not far more wicked than demons, which are the ones that God charged with folly, the ones that he doesn't trust. It's sort of difficult to know if he's talking about angels specifically. So he says saints in verse 15, but then in verse 16, how much more abominable and filthy is man? So he's comparing man to saints. So either he's asserting that the saints of the past are different than the men of now, that they're somehow risen above, they're a different caste, or by saints he is referring to angels specifically. It's hard to know exactly which. Either way, he is somewhat incorrect in his assertions. And while it is true that men are far more evil than the holy angels, his saints will not always be. The ones who are saved will eventually be elevated higher than the angels, as we see in the book of Hebrews. So a lot of his information is incorrect. This is because the devil doesn't know what he's talking about, or if he does, just doesn't care and lies anyway. And that's who he's getting his information from. It says in verse 17, I will show thee, hear me, and that which I have seen I will declare. Now, this is Eliphaz's trademark, what I have seen. That's what it's always about, what he sees, what he thinks about, what he knows. Everything's based on his own personal experience. This is a common pitfall of false doctrine and false teachers. The moment someone starts talking about what they've seen as evidence for a truth, particularly a biblical or spiritual truth, you should turn your brain off immediately and stop listening to them, because they have no idea what they're talking about. And that's what Eliphaz is about to do. He says in verse 18, which wise men have told from their fathers, and have not hid it, unto whom alone the earth was given, and no stranger passed among them. Now, this seems to be referring to Noah and his sons and the first few generations after them. He says that the earth was given to them, there was no stranger. That sounds like a group of people who inhabited an empty world and had basically the entire thing to themselves. So he's claiming that this wisdom that he's about to impart comes from the fathers of old and his own eyes. Now, again, we've already talked about the logical fallacy of appealing to authority and why you shouldn't trust someone's own lived experience as evidence for much of anything. So what he's about to say has some kernels of truth and a lot of falsehood, and the general purpose of all of it is very much incorrect. So in verse 20, it says, the wicked man travaileth with pain all his days, and the number of years is hidden to the oppressor. A dreadful sound is in his ears. In prosperity the destroyer shall come upon him. He believeth not that he shall return out of darkness, and he is waited for of the sword. He wandereth abroad for bread, saying, where is it? He knoweth that the day of darkness is ready at his hand. Trouble and anguish shall make him afraid. They shall prevail against him as a king ready to the battle. For he stretcheth out his hand against God, and strengtheneth himself against the Almighty. He runneth upon him, even on his neck, upon the thick bosses of his bucklers, because he covereth his face with fatness, and maketh callops of fat on his flanks. And he dwelleth in desolate cities, and in houses which no man inhabiteth, which are ready to become heaps. He shall not be rich, neither shall his substance continue, neither shall he prolong the perfection thereof upon the earth. He shall not depart out of darkness, the flame shall dry up his branches, and by the breath of his mouth shall he go away. Let not him that is deceived trust in vanity, for vanity shall be his recompense. It shall be accomplished before his time, and his branch shall not be green. He shall shake off his unripe grape as the vine, and shall cast off the flower as the olive. For the congregation of hypocrites shall be desolate, and fire shall consume the tabernacles of bribery. They conceive mischief, and bring forth vanity, and their belly prepareth deceit. So his primary thesis is that the wicked men suffer all the time. They don't have peace, they don't have prosperity, they don't have anything. Now, first, if that were true, if that's how the world functioned, then why would everyone try so hard to get ahead in business by lying and cheating and stealing? If they knew it wouldn't work, then they wouldn't do it. Some people would, but for the most part, people wouldn't. But they do, and they did then as well. We know that Uz is a city, and we know that the first city was Babel, which means this is far after Nimrod and the fall of Babel. With that in mind, that means men have already seen how wicked people can become, because Nimrod was the inventor of idolatry, and with idolatry you have the murder of children, and you have sexual perversion of every color. So Nimrod had all of that in Babel. That's why they gathered together. If you look in Genesis, for the reason they gathered together to make a city, they said, "Lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth as God commanded." Their whole purpose for gathering together was to stick their finger in the eye of God. That was Nimrod and his people's entire job, because Nimrod wanted their souls. He was the inventor of idolatry, but not as in he set up the first idols. He was the first idol. The idea of a god taking human form and then dying and sort of ascending and leaving behind a partial human, partial god remnant, like the pharaohs of Egypt used to be considered divine in blood, or the shoguns of Japan prior to World War II, which their people believed were divine, that comes from Nimrod. His son Tammuz was the first one who he claimed was divine and man. And that myth just sort of persisted throughout almost every single human society on earth for thousands of years. That's where most divine, or most noble and royal bloodlines came from, where someone asserting, "I've got divine blood in me," based on some random ancestry. And almost all of it can be traced right back to Tammuz and Nimrod. So he was a very wicked man, caused immense damage and destruction, caused the dividing of humanity across the earth, caused the splitting of languages. That was him. And he has already been here because Uz exists, and Uz is a city, and the first city was Babel. So they already know that wicked men don't always live in misery and fear and have nothing all day. Nimrod was one of the most powerful men on earth. He had everything that he wanted. So Eliphaz's statements as far as how wicked men live day to day are partially true. They are in fear all the time. God talks about that. When you have ill-gotten gains, you know that judgment is coming for you. It's why these people try so hard to get past that, to ignore the judgments of God, to believe in things like evolution. It's because they don't want to confront the fact that they have committed a lot of evil to get where they are, and they're going to be judged for it. So he's right that they live in fear and despair and paranoia. He is not right that they live without bread, wandering about begging, that there are people ready to take everything from them, and that happens routinely. Sometimes it does. If you look at Israel in the northern kingdom, they barely had a king last for more than just a few years before his entire bloodline would be wiped out by one of his generals or one of his advisors, and that guy would rule for 5 seconds, and then someone else would kill him and his whole bloodline, and that just kind of happened. Those times, the destroyers did come in and wipe them all out, but that has not always been the case. Some of these kings lived a very long time. Ahab lived for 20-something years and ruled terribly in Jerusalem. He never faced that. No one killed him except a foreign enemy that he went off to fight. It wasn't one of his own people, and that person who killed him didn't take everything he had. It was someone else entirely who did that. You have people like Stalin, who lived well into his 70s and died in his bed, or Genghis Khan, who lived into his 80s. Genghis Khan is one of the most evil men who ever lived. He killed millions by his own hand and the orders of his men. He was known to kill and eat children. He was a terrible, terrible human being, and he lived well into his 80s and died peacefully in his own sleep, passing his entire empire off to his chosen favored son. So the wicked do not always lie in fear. They don't always have short lives. Sometimes they amass great power, great wealth, and they commit untold atrocities for decades before God cuts them down. So Eliphaz's claims that the wicked live in this sort of fear all the time, and that's legitimate because they get their stuff taken from them all the time. It's true in some contexts, and it's very false in others. But really his whole purpose for saying that is to say to Job, because the wicked live like that, which I'm asserting even though I have no evidence of that, and all the evidence is against me, but I'm going to assert it and you're supposed to take it as true. Because they live like that, That's why you were afraid of losing everything you ever had, which Job said he was afraid of happening. So you were afraid of it because you did all the sin, so you knew that was going to happen to you. And this all happened to you because you're wicked, like all the other men that I talked about. So you should just repent and not be wicked anymore, and then this won't happen anymore. It's always the argument that he makes. It's how he concludes every single argument. In this one, he doesn't actually go after Job specifically. He doesn't say, so you should repent. But he said it at the end of every other argument, so of all of his friends. I think he's trying to avoid it this time because he's trying not to rile up Job more. Eliphaz is still the most calm and collected out of the friends, but that is his primary argument. Because this happens to the wicked, you're wicked. Job is wicked, but he is more righteous than any man on earth, than I think anyone who's ever lived since, barring the Lord Jesus Christ. So Eliphaz's arguments are, of course, very flawed, very false, and as always, designed only to make himself feel better so that he doesn't have to face the reality that he is entirely in God's hand, and God will do with him as he pleases. All right. Well, that's going to do it for tonight. You are dismissed.